welcome this afternoon to this event, this wonderful event I've been so looking forward to. My name is Katie White. I am the chair of the Mindfulness Initiative. I also work at the World Wildlife Foundation, so this is of very much interest to me. We are joined by a really exciting panel of wonderful people today to launch this document, which is a collaboration between the Mindfulness Initiative and the Lund University Centre for Sustainability Studies. We're going to be introduced by the co-authors Jamie Bristow and Rosie Bell, and by Christine Wamsler from Lund University Centre for Sustainability Studies. And with huge thanks to the Emergence Foundation for their support in delivering on this. Pilar, who is somewhere on the Zoom, spotlighted somewhere, is going to be our Zoom manager. So please do put questions, because at the end of the session, you will have an opportunity to ask that question. You will be on mute throughout the presentations, but at the end, if you're okay, we'd like to ask you to invite you to ask that question. So I'm also going to ask Ruth to introduce Ruth Ormston, who is the co-director of the Mindfulness Initiative. And then we are very lucky to be joined by the grandfather of mindfulness, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who has already taught me something before we have even begun this session. So thank you very much. If I could hand over to Ruth, who's just going to do a brief introduction of the Mindfulness Initiative.
Thank you very much, Katie, and welcome everybody. It's absolutely lovely to see you here. Before I actually go into my introduction, we're aware that in this event we're talking about the climate crisis, but also the news recently has been filled with another type of crisis. And we thought it might be helpful for people just to have a moment of mindfulness to open this session, where we can send out our thoughts and our love to all involved in the situation in the Ukraine and everybody affected by it. So if it's okay with everybody, I'm just going to set a timer and we're just going to do a short minute's silence. Thank you very much, everybody. So welcome to everybody who's joined us in the last minute. We're aware that most of you on this may know who the Mindfulness Initiative are, but there might be some of you who don't. So we thought it'd be useful to just give you a brief overview of who we are and what we do. So the Mindfulness Initiative is a policy think tank that really grew out of a mindfulness teaching programme in the UK Parliament. That was in 2013. And out of that teaching programme, there was a group of politicians who had a real hunger for mindfulness after learning it, and really wanted to look at how mindfulness could impact issues of public policy. And so a mindfulness all-party parliamentary group was formed, and we worked with them to run a series of inquiries within the UK Parliament and publish a report called Mindful Nation UK in 2015, which looked at the evidence base for mindfulness across 4 different sectors: health, education, the criminal justice sector, and the workplace. And it made recommendations in relation to each of those. And we continue to work with UK policymakers, but through our global network, we also work further afield, and we've supported the introduction of mindfulness programs in around 14 countries, the legislatures of 14 countries, and we're supporting other areas as well. And more recently, we've expanded our scope to look at how mindfulness and compassion can help with some of the larger, more complex and entrenched societal and political issues of our time, such as political polarization, the distractions of the digital economy, and in this report, the climate crisis. And we hope to write on those issues, but also hold and convene really important conversations that help drive change. We're really honoured to collaborate with some leading academics and partners in the world. And on this particular occasion, we were honoured to work with Lund University Centre for Sustainability Studies, a world-class centre for sustainability research, teaching and impact. So if you like the sound of what we do, there are tons of publications and resources available on our website, mindfulness.org. And all of them are free to download, so please do go and check them out. As well as being a think tank, we're also a charity registered in England and Wales. We don't receive any public funding or any funding from government, despite our links to policymakers. So if you're interested in supporting us in that way, please do also check out our website. But without further ado, I really hope you enjoy this launch. I'm really, really excited to hear it. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and great to hear from you to set the context. Before I hand it over to Jon, just to say, I think some of you may have seen this week was also the launch of the latest IPCC report on climate change. Jamie and I have been involved in various ways in the climate change sector for a couple of decades. And unfortunately, although there is more appetite to take action and more action is happening, we're also further from where we need to be. And there are those two truths, and we need to hold those two truths, that climate change is happening faster than we are responding. And in that context, we need to look at how we can change our response and how we can change our response systems. And I'm really excited and honoured to be part of this process. But I'll hand over to Jon to have some opening reflections.
Well, thank you, Katie, and I'm just delighted to be here with all of you, and a very deep bow to the authors of this report. This, I think, is going to be a kind of seminal vehicle in some sense, unifying and taking to the next level the urgency and the profundity of what we're facing as a species on this planet, and how the nature of the human mind is such that when it doesn't know itself, it can create nightmare scenarios like the one we're seeing unfold at the present moment in Ukraine, which itself is, of course, unsustainable, unbelievably retrograde on every conceivable level, and really is calling the entirety of the world to recognize a certain profound interconnectedness that is, when one practices meditation, in particular mindfulness meditation, really the first thing one realizes, and it's just patently obvious, is a sense of interconnectedness, the interconnectedness of inner and outer, that the body needs to breathe, that we are dependent on the atmosphere just for that. And so in the spirit of Greta Thunberg and her vocabulary, that she takes something that many people might see as a deficit or a liability, in other words, her own challenges being someplace on the Asperger's autism spectrum, and she redefines it as a superpower. Without any kind of disrespect to that particular orientation, I think we could very easily ascribe that same power to mindfulness itself when it's understood correctly and instantiated and embodied in us as individual human beings and in our organizations and creative institutions in ways that really we haven't recognized until now. We have this kind of superpower to transform what might be possible, understanding what it is that we know, and keeping in mind, even more importantly, what it is that we don't know, and what it is that we may not even recognize that we don't know. And this is what one might call wisdom, or a kind of sort of non-boundaried compassion for the recognition of our common humanity, and the fact that we live in a very narrow band, what's called often the Goldilocks zone, but there are many different ways to understand that metaphor, where too much of something is not good and too little of something is not good. So we need to find those sustainable dynamics that keep the whole thing within the very delicate limits of what is possible for life on this planet to flourish at this particular moment in time. And if we're capable of developing multi-gazillion dollar instruments like the LIGO detectors that detected gravity waves. And we're capable of launching a telescope and putting it out past the moon with platinum mirrors that it's going to take 6 months to completely refine so that it can look deeply into space, more deeply than ever before, and therefore more deeply back in time to the very origin of who knows what this is that we call universe. If we're capable of that, where the slightest little error of 1 million different people contributing to it would ruin the entire thing, billions of dollars down the tube. If we're capable of that, we're capable of sustaining life on Earth for all species, not just for the human species, and understanding that profound interconnectedness. So I just want to bow to and congratulate the Mindfulness Initiative and the entire team that's pulled this document together. And like any other document, in order for it to really serve, it can't just be put on the shelf or filed away in your laptop. It needs to touch us. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation as really the opening conversation of a deep, meditative, collective love affair and inquiry into how we can optimize our own human multiple geniuses, intelligences, and minimize our own impulse. We all perhaps have a little bit of Putin inside of ourselves. Let's face it, where we're contracted and we're fearful and we'll lash out and do anything to protect that tiny little piece of ourself that's actually completely tortured and in pain. And if we could only embrace it with loving kindness, it would evaporate into a much larger well-being. And when that doesn't happen, of course, then we have, genocide and what's raining down at the moment on, an independent country. It's just completely, at the mercy of a larger neighbor with a kind of psychotic view of history. So I'm really very moved to just have the kind of love affair that I'm having with the Mindfulness Initiative and a deep sort of honoring of the amount of work and the love that's going into these projects that I think are going to excite and not only excite, but also inspire individuals and leaders and more groups of people to put our shoulder to the wheel and recognize that this is what we might call an all hands on deck moment on Spaceship Earth in terms of sustainability. And we don't have any planet B to default to. We're all on this one Spaceship Earth in that Goldilocks zone together. Let's wake up to that.
Thank you, John. That was a beautiful introduction. And on the spirit of the love affair, I think we should take that through. And it reminded me, I was in a school this morning doing an assembly and the children were getting cross about people and palm oil and cussing out. And I said, look, you have to fall in love with the planet. You have to fall in love with the earth and you have to know what it is. And that will sustain you, because anger won't sustain you. You have to be able to love it. And I was like, and in all people, I believe that, there is human kindness and goodness, and you work with that and we show them, and we have to be able to do it together. So in that love affair, I'm going to hand over to Jamie and Rosie, who are going to say a brief hello. They are a really dynamic duo, and I so enjoyed being able to work with them last time and work with Jamie very closely as well. And then they will hand straight over to Christine. So these are our authors, and they are a pretty special bunch, Jamie Bristow and Rosie Bell.
Thank you so much, Katie. First of all, hello from us. This is a really special moment for me. I have been working towards this for 12 years. I left the climate change world. I was working in a climate change campaign and was really trying to think what my next contribution would be. I looked at my life and my trajectory that took me from working in an advertising agency thinking that was no problem at all, and in fact, wanted to be a chief executive of an agency one day. That was my main ambition. To giving up my position, initially volunteering, and then getting a job in climate change communications. And I looked at that trajectory and I thought, what changed? What led me to this about face? And it was my mindfulness practice, the greater sensitivity and awareness and care, that meant that the same facts landed differently, resonated differently. And I had this sort of vague intuition that this dimension was ignored, the inner dimension in general, but the mindfulness in particular. And it's taken me 12 years to articulate that properly. And it's taken that long probably for many of us who've had that, that intuition. There are many people now working at the intersection between inner and outer in this way. But so yeah, I'm thrilled that we've got here, that we can have this conversation about this. And I'm looking forward to introducing an overview of what we've written. But first of all, anything to add, Rosie, by way of hello?
Just hello. I'm going to be a silent partner on this one. We've got a lot to get through in a very short period of time, but just thank you so much to all of you for joining us. I feel very privileged to be involved in collaborating with Jamie and the great Christine, and being a co-author on this. So, but yeah, silent partner.
Yes, silent-ish today, but if you enjoy reading the document at all, that is probably Rosie's doing, being our copywriter expert, as well as thinking partner. So yeah, big thank you, Rosie, for your input. Okay, so we're going to move over to Christine now. Christine, co-author and sort of eminent researcher, who's going to give us some background about how we got sort of background to where we pick up this report, so her research and the wider picture. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Rosie. Let me share my screen. Okay, does that work? Okay, good. So good afternoon, everybody. It is such a joy to join you at this launch today and to share this moment with you. I hope that this coming together will nourish our hearts and minds, John, that it should become a love affair. And I also hope that it gives you an insight into what is in our policy report. Jamie asked me to say some words about the background and context of our Activate Change project and the resultant policy report from a research perspective. So let's see. Yeah. I'd like to begin by highlighting that our report builds on a program of work that has been conducted over a number of years, which demonstrates that both scholars and policymakers have started considering human inner qualities and capacities as key in addressing climate change. Examples from my own work are, for instance, empirical studies from the past two international climate conferences, COP25 and COP26, which have shown the need for new mindsets, that is, improved relational qualities and new modes of knowing, being, and acting to improve current policy approaches. The outcomes were confirmed by our recent systematic review of the academic literature, which analyzed how the linkages between inner and outer change to support sustainability and climate action are portrayed and understood in current research. On the basis of analysis of current knowledge and associated gaps, we propose an integrated model that shows how 5 clusters of transformative inner qualities or capacities are related to certain worldviews, beliefs, and values that delineate our relationships with ourselves, others, and the world around us. These influence in turn our agency to support change across individual, collective, and systems level. Importantly, our review, like other work in the field, also highlights the potential role of mindfulness and compassion in this context, so long as it's not applied in an instrumentalized way and becomes devoid of its ecological and social awareness. This means that mindfulness and compassion have the potential to influence all 5 clusters of transformative capacities and can in themselves be seen as transformational. So looking ahead, we also highlight that it is crucial to explore if and how related approaches can best be oriented towards sustainability and mainstreamed into current institutional policy structures. And our policy report is an important step in this direction. Now, turning to our Activate Change project, here again, there are some important aspects that I would like to highlight from a research perspective. It is important to underline that the project itself has involved extensive research. And Jamie and Rosie, I want to say how deeply grateful I am for the opportunity to collaborate with you. It has brought me so much joy to be able to work with you and dedicate my time to a field that we are also committed to. We worked together for at least 18 months, and during this time, I conducted 25 in-depth interviews with politicians and policymakers around the world. And in parallel, we read a lot of literature and we held extensive consultations with leading experts working on the intersection between the inner and outer transformation that we need for sustainability. Then we put together the findings from the interviews and the wider consultation to get an insight into how people are thinking about these issues. Because we wanted to understand how they perceive the intersection of mind and climate change, how it is currently considered in policy making, and how it could be further considered in policy making to bring about the changes that we seek. The first outcome of this work was the preparation of an academic article, which in turn provided a strong foundation for our policy report. Unfortunately, the article is currently still under review, so we cannot share it with you yet, but I would like to flag some of the principal results here. A key finding was that we can divide the ways in which policymakers, politicians, and experts perceive the intersection of mind and climate change into 4 categories. Firstly, our minds are clearly a victim of increasing climate impacts, leading to a vast increase in climate anxiety across society. So one of the first things you generally hear politicians talk about is the number of young people who are feeling grief, anxiety, overwhelm, or fear as a result of the ecological collapse and the kind of projections that we are currently looking at. Secondly, a less common but increasingly prominent perspective is that the mind is described as being a key driver or root cause of the climate crisis. We tend to think of climate change as a technical problem, and most sustainability policy adopts that approach. However, we are increasingly starting to understand that actually there are certain human tendencies and mechanisms of mind that drive, for instance, consumerism, our patterns of production and consumption. And they ultimately relate to our disconnection to ourselves, others, and nature, and underlie the climate crisis. Thirdly, we found that the mind is identified as a barrier to climate action. So not only is it seen as a driver and a victim, but we can also see certain biases or even denial. There are a myriad of ways in which we are our own worst enemy when it comes to actually making change happen. And I expect that you're probably very familiar with this. And finally, there are some policymakers who have a good understanding of the first 3 categories. And these people clearly see the vicious cycle that is created between the mind and climate change. For instance, as much as mind is driving climate change is driving negative mental health, well-being, etc., or fear, which in turn exacerbate certain unsustainable response mechanisms at individual and collective levels. So ultimately, this vicious cycle drives the deterioration of personal and planetary well-being. At the same time, Jamie and I show in our research article that this vicious cycle of mind and climate change is unfortunately not addressed in mainstream climate policy and policy-making approaches, which consequently fail to adequately address climate change. We also found that climate policy tends to adopt the same frame of reference or language. In other words, it operates with the same mindset that created the climate crisis in the first place. Although we can see that some people have been trying to change or challenge that mindset from without, we very rarely find that our assumptions are challenged from within mainstream climate policy institutions. And moreover, the few exceptions, the individual pioneers who engage in challenging current approaches from within tend to be marginalized. Finally, our article identifies some important lessons from other policy fields, such as education, health, workplace, and policy integration, that provide insights into how to better integrate aspects of mind into climate policies. We have taken up some of these lessons in our policy report that we present today. Importantly, and Katie already noticed that at the beginning, we see the report as a jumping off point for a more informed and nuanced debate about how best to intervene on a long neglected front in the struggle towards sustainability. Whilst our work is still in progress, we sincerely hope that it can contribute to a much needed overdue change in our current approaches to climate change and sustainability. We urgently need to nourish capacities such as mindfulness and compassion that help us to reconnect to ourselves, others, and nature, and to respond to the world with intentional action. They are important to address the inner dimensions of climate change, which are ultimately not individual problems or challenges, but rather a manifestation of a collective experience and process. There's one final aspect that I would like to highlight in this context, as it comes up very frequently, and that is the urgency of the situation. My personal take on this is that there are many apparent paradoxes when dealing with climate change, as there are when engaging with contemplative practices. And one of them is the fact that slowing down in the sense of becoming still and finding stillness inside of us might mean moving forward faster in the end. Change can in fact be quick if we start addressing and linking systems change, behavioral change, cultural change, and at the same time associated individual inner dimensions and capacities such as mindfulness and compassion. To conclude, I'm happy to see so many of you here today, interested in joining us in the daily struggle and journey towards a more comprehensive and integral approach to sustainability. Thank you for being with us in this journey and for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Much.
Thank you, Christine. That was brilliant. Thank you. I know it's hard to canter through work when there's so much depth and thought, but you did that masterfully. So I really appreciate you going through it. It was wonderful. I'm going to hand back to Jamie and Rosie, who are going to talk through. But just to remind, if anybody's got any questions or questions come up, please do feel free to post them in the chat or to Pilar, and we can either ask them or you will have the chance to ask them at the end. Thank you. Over to Jamie, and thank you again, Christine.
Thank you, Katie. And just before you go, Christine, I just wanted to acknowledge what a huge contribution you've already made to this space. It's a great gift to the world that you, as a an established and very influential sustainability sciences professor, is interested in this in a dimension, and you've done a large part of the work that is available on this subject. And indeed, it's both your work and your campaigning that meant that the inner dimension has been mentioned in an IPCC report for the first time. I think Katie alluded to this earlier. So Christine, before you go, I just wondered whether you could explain what came out yesterday, and what did it say that's kind of groundbreaking and sets a great backdrop for what we're talking about here today.
Yes, so basically yesterday, the IPCC report that came out yesterday is the one on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And it really, it mentions for the first time in an explicit way the importance of connecting inner and outer dimensions of sustainability. And in that context, the importance of mindsets and supporting nature-society connectedness. And in the place where it is mentioned actually is also supported by references which relate to mindfulness. So I think that's quite an interesting thing to see in an IPCC report.
Yes, absolutely. And that's down to you. At least two mentions to the word mindfulness in the references section anyway, maybe one day in the main body. Okay. Thank you for that very well prepared and polished presentation, Christine. Unfortunately, as I've been, really scrambling to get the document out, my contribution won't be quite so together. And in fact, what I've found over the years of creating policy reports like this one is that it takes me a couple of years to be able to summarize them and communicate them effectively in a short presentation. So maybe come back and listen to this again another time. And also I'm going to try and do it quickly so we've got time for conversation and questions. And that means I'm only going to be able to gloss over. Yeah, great. Okay, so yes, welcome everybody. As Christine said, we have been doing a lot of listening to policymakers and to experts in the field. So we had lots of interviews, conversations, and also a consultation survey that many of you here today I can see responded to. And what was interesting there is that there was a lot of difference, a lot of variance in how people were framing the inner dimension of the crisis, where the mind meets the ecological situation. But yet there are many themes. There wasn't sort of one narrative, and I feel that that's a bit of a weakness because there isn't one hymn sheet. It sounds so different in different people's mouths. And so if I was a policymaker who hadn't considered this at all, it would seem like everyone's saying different things and it's a bit fragmented. But I think there's an opportunity to move towards a place where we're all roughly saying something similar, singing from the same hymn sheet, and telling a story which is sort of clear enough, as well as deep and profound enough to really cut through. So that's been part of the work, really, both reviewing the evidence and fitting it into a framework where we can communicate it well, but within an overarching narrative and a story which makes sense to people and is clear. Most people we spoke to had some sense that the climate crisis is at the most profound level a relationship crisis. And yes, a relationship crisis. And the story that we alighted upon, having asked people about these about where mind meets climate, was a story that we're not, we're far from the first to pick up on this, but a story of separation versus connection. So Charles Eisenstein, Paul Hawken, various sort of popular writers have focused on this. Otto Scharmer as well, within the kind of contemplative mindfulness space. And this felt to us to be the clearest and most coherent way of talking about both the inner life and also the role of mindfulness and compassion. So we wrote a report that have called Reconnection: Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out. So I'm going to start off with the why of why this report was needed. Christine mentioned most of this already. There's a neglect of inner factors that leave theories of change wanting. Scholars and activists have begun to identify this human story of disconnection as the common thread of our crises. However, connection is inescapable. It's not that we are actually disconnected because we are in an interconnected world. It's the lack of living as if we're interconnected. It's the lack of understanding and the feeling of connection that's the problem. And the lack of the resulting values and behaviors that would stem from that sort of felt sense of connection. So how do we get this understanding and this feeling of connection? That's what we're wanting to address. This sense that this sort of feeling in your bones that there is nowhere we can throw anything away, because there is no away. It's just somewhere else in the same place that we are. We point to the fact that environmental destruction is literally senseless, because it reflects our collective failure to feel the harm that we're creating. And it's been very interesting how the plastics, plastic pollution in the ocean has become this very, very visible symbol. And the first thing to really connect us to, at a kind of global level across different countries, this sense of away being a fantasy. Particularly we highlight that we're not just disconnected from our environment, and indeed from others who we would rely upon to respond collectively, but also from ourselves. We're disconnected from our emotions. We can be, rather, unconscious of our emotions, our bodies, and what is truly important to us, our values, and that these different forms of disconnection interrelate with each other. So that's the, why is this a report important, and why is this report framed in the way that it is? Now, how have we pulled this together? We explore the cognitive and emotional foundations of connection. The largest amount of writing is about the inner dimension in general, and the cognitive emotional connections in general. And then we thread through with that why mindfulness and compassion could be two leading approaches and fundamental human capacities that are most relevant and most helpful. As I've just said, we focus on mindfulness and compassion as powerful enablers of reconnection, fostering a resilience, engagement, and ultimately action. I'll gloss this because we have said, as Christine said, we draw on the emerging evidence base, linking mindfulness and compassion to sustainability, and the much larger and more developed evidence base, with now, I think it's over 17,000 articles that mention mindfulness in keywords, abstracts, or titles. So this isn't new stuff in many of the areas, and we synthesize the insights that Christine mentioned from our research, our direct research on this. So what have we got as a result? We have put our work into this report into two chapters. The first chapter looks at the fundamental aspects of human connection and the ways in which mindfulness and compassion always serve us, by which I don't mean mindfulness and compassion practice or training are always right for all people at all times, but that these are human natural capacities which are important to our interface with the world and with ourselves. And then we go on to chapter 2, which looks particularly at the ways in which disconnection contributes to this most urgent global crisis, and how restoring conscious connection through mindfulness and compassion can help. So this is this is not the definitive view. This isn't the end of the road. This is very much the beginning. We see this as a jumping off point, not just for our future work, but hopefully for, for more collaboration and more conversation. So this is a jumping off point for what we hope will be more informed and nuanced debate about how to include inner dimensions in the struggle towards sustainability. And that's one reason why we're launching this document at this point as a consultation draft, so that you have 3 or 4 weeks now to read it as soon as you can, so you can incorporate your comments if you have any. We will then launch a kind of finished version at an event tailored for a policymaker audience, inviting politicians that we have developed relationships with to speak about their personal practice and their hopes for mindfulness in the context of sustainability. So what this isn't, however, what we don't do is, what we're not doing is thinking that current practical and policy approaches to climate change are wrong. This is not an alternative. This is about integrating, as Christine's alluded to. We don't suggest mindfulness and compassion are necessarily sufficient on their own to create, a deep transformation. They can potentially, particularly in the case of mindfulness, really prepare the ground within which seeds of change can really flourish. And then those seeds, the education content that mindfulness training and practice can go with, could be, absolutely vital. We don't propose that all types of mindfulness training will deliver the deep and transformative benefits. Some people have mindfulness on their Apple Watch, which involves just basically, as far as I'm aware, sort of breathing for a minute. Just breathing for a minute once a day probably isn't going to do what we're describing. Not all types of mindfulness are the same. I should probably offer a definition for mindfulness. I realize we haven't done that. We sort of forget now. But mindfulness is a type of awareness. It is awareness that arises when we pay attention to what's happening in and around us on purpose, with particular qualities, and that's with openness, curiosity, allowing, and care. And so this seems like something. It seems quite straightforward, and in one way it is, but actually, it takes some familiarizing yourself with and you training of the heart and mind to make it a kind of a fundamental part of our lives over time. And what we don't do is claim that the science is complete. More research is needed. The first chapter is broken into 3 sections. We have the mind, the mind-heart section, mind-body section, and then the mind-body-heart section. One of the reasons for doing this is to emphasize that these are all interrelated capacities. And although we have to, for the sake of a linear document, break them out, from the very start, we want to point to not create kind of separations where the whole thing's about sort of connection and interrelation. So in the mind section, we look first at reclaiming the attention. The attention's fundamental to perceiving the world, and beyond that, sort of regulating our different cognitive capacities to render our world for us, to create our world. Our powers of attention are potentially underdeveloped and increasingly undermined by the attention economy. This is the huge, the attention is the new oil, it's been said, because to fragment and capture our attention and sell it to the highest bidder is big business. Increasing receptivity. So beyond just helping us to reclaim the attention, mindfulness can help us to broaden the bandwidth of awareness. Those qualities I mentioned of open, allowing, curiosity, and care help work together in order to be more sensitive to signals we're getting from inside us, from within the body, but also from around us, and particularly to have a beginner's mind and and turn towards or allow information which contradicts our existing beliefs. Next, we look at perspective taking and how this is crucial to not just developing new information, but seeing things from a different perspective. This is a very, very common bit of feedback we get from politicians who take mindfulness training in the British Parliament and in other parliaments we've worked in. They often talk about perspective as being one of the things that they get from that, how they can see things from different points of view. We move on to the body, or the mind-body, next, and crucially the role of the fact that the human mind is really the human mind-body, or mind-body-heart. That we are that we tend to think of ourselves as just our brains and our bodies carry us from meeting to meeting and not much more. But in fact, we are deeply embodied cognizers, and connecting to the body more brings online a greater level of signal that we can use to discern better. Next, we have the threat response, looking at our interpersonal neurobiology, as it's being called. So this is the way in which we respond to threatening information and how this can derail our relationships and sort of collaborative and productive relationship. We then look at how our nervous systems can be dysregulated through stressful events that are either too much, too fast, or too soon for our minds to process at the time. It's thought that up to 70% of us will have experienced just in sort of childhood alone things which may well dysregulate our nervous system, and there's debate around whether we call this trauma or not, but certainly the prevalence of this in the population and the fact that it means that we have a kind of heightened threat responses is really relevant to how we respond to collective challenges, particularly one which is so threatening as the climate crisis. Moving on to mind, body, heart, we look at the foundational role of our emotions, how we are privileged, how we often privilege the intellect, the IQ over EQ, or our emotional intelligence, and we're only trying to solve problems and work together, therefore, with part of our capacities to do so. And we show how mindfulness has been shown to underpin important parts of our emotional intelligence, like empathy and social perspective taking. We then, having built up this foundation, then we move into the kind of the jewel of our evolutionary inheritance, compassion, and how that particularly has helped us to develop, to work together as hunter-gatherer societies, to develop to the point where we are now. We introduce it not as a kind of a nice to have or sort of sentimental soft skill, but actually as something importantly functional about how societies work, group action and collective action is effective, and how we can respond in the context of the ecological challenges we face now. Moving on to chapter 2, this is to remind you, moving on from the sort of foundations of human connection, the cognitive and emotional capacities that underpin it. This is looking at connection in the context of the climate crisis in particular. As Christine mentioned, one of the things that policymakers are most likely to be aware of already is the impact of the climate crisis on the people's mental health and particularly on the youth. So our first section looks at broadly how we can resource ourselves, both and develop the intention and appetite to turn towards difficult information, to to challenge our views, and to keep on working at the coalface of climate action. So we look at the mindfulness and compassion can resource us, and they have kind of constituent attitudinal foundations that help us turn towards the difficult. To develop psychological resilience so that we're able to do so sustainably, both in terms of managing negative emotions, but also in terms of upregulating and developing positive emotions like hope, optimism, and gratitude that help us to persevere and resource us. And it sort of, there's evidence to believe, and many advocates have said so, that rather than making people terrified, I mean, a little bit of a little bit of worry and anxiety may well motivate us a bit, but actually we need a great sense of shared endeavor, shared purpose, and an optimistic mindset, what is called stubborn optimism or active hope by some writers. And there's evidence that mindfulness and compassion can really help with that. We then turn to how connection or an understanding or a felt sense of connection is vitally important. Christine mentioned the word mindsets. We first look at an important part of our mindsets, our worldview, and how we need a worldview of interconnection, a holistic worldview, an understanding of our interbeing, our interrelatedness with all things, all life, and all phenomena on this planet. We look at what, rather than just talking about needing a different worldview, what kind of practices could we do to make shifting inquiry into worldviews possible, and the kind of the shifting of worldviews to ones that are wiser, frankly, and more appropriate for the complexity of our global civilization. We then look at a particular challenge that we're facing now, perhaps we have always faced, but is being amplified and worsened through the digital prism through which we experience our lives. And we show the evidence that mindfulness and compassion can help us to overcome this. There's one particular study that came out recently that showed that quite simply mindfulness reduces our affective polarization. So this is the likelihood that we will dislike or distrust people who have different views from us. And in the context of the climate crisis, it's the sort of the kiss of death, really, if actual climate views get heavily polarized, as they are being in some countries. So addressing polarization isn't just a kind of a nice to have. It could be absolutely vital if we're going to work together, challenge each other, but ultimately collaborate. We then look at the vital importance of nature connection. So this is thought to be one of the most important inner dimensions of sustainability, like the extent to which we feel we are identified with nature, that we are connected to nature. Those of us who are highly connected to nature are twice as likely to exhibit pro-environmental behaviors. And it's also shown that time in nature upregulates mindfulness. Mindfulness helps us to not just spend time there. We could be in nature just taking Instagram photographs of ourselves, but to actually really embed ourselves and feel part of that experience. Then finally, we move on to the tip of the spear, the event, what we actually need to do in the context of all this. We address the problem of consumerism, our values, what we want in life, and misunderstandings about where happiness lies, and the fact that the inquiry and the insight that could come through mindfulness it could well, evidence suggests, help us to change our appetites and change what we value, and then to discern more clearly what it is that we, what we find important, and to have a clearer, more discerning inner compass that can help us in the moment maintain that rudder and that clear view of what is more deeply important, rather than the kind of the messages that we get bombarded with from our consumer culture and others prevailing currents in mainstream culture. And then finally, we look at perhaps where mindfulness training, particularly, often this is where people start when they're explaining what mindfulness is and why it might be important. This is to say, mindfulness helps us to respond creatively, not react blindly. It helps us to step out of autopilot and not be derailed by our the kind of the legacy of our evolutionary inheritance, or indeed by just sort of habit and inertia, but instead, again, responding to the world more in line with what we really think is important, true, good, and beautiful. So in conclusion, a critical dimension of the crisis has been excluded from the prevalent view, from the mainstream policy landscape. Physical and practical solutions depend wholly upon these contingent capacities of human mind and heart that have been absent, that have so far been absent. So we still need those physical and practical solutions, but the public appetite for them, the wanting of them, the desiring of them, the innovation, the collaboration, and the eventual sort of individual behaviors, as well as the systemic change, all require a consideration of this completely, largely neglected dimension. And to quote from the ending, our conclusion, merely our broken relationships constitute the climate crisis. And this report has introduced some of the ways in which mindfulness and compassion, as trainable, foundational capacities, can support us to repair our bonds of conscious connection with ourselves, with each other, and with the natural world. And we finish with some recommendations, which we'd love your views on, along with the rest of the document, to different functions, particularly government and public institutions, about what this really means in practice. Like, if you read this document as a policymaker, you accept its recommendations. What can we do as a result? So I have taken a lot longer than I said I would, but then this is my first outing. As a result, John and Katie, I think we're going to come back to John, but we also have lots of questions. So I wonder, Katie, how you want to handle that? But I think probably giving time for people.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Jamie. That's wonderful. A real tour de force. I would really encourage people to read the document, though, because it is so deep and thoughtful, and I'm grateful to you and the other authors for all the input. I think we have got a lot of questions, but I would love for John to just give some reflections on the session, and then we'll go as swiftly as we can and get through as many questions as we can. John, is that okay?
Well, personally speaking, I'm find myself resonating in the aftermath of what Christine and Jamie have shared with us, and the real potential import of the depth when we transcend the dualism of inner and outer. In a very real way, there's no inner and there's no outer. There's just reality. And then there's this evolved function that we have very little understanding of, that we call mind. And as Jamie pointed out rightly, very rightly, it's embodied, another mystery. And we're all here for a very brief moment in time that we call a lifetime, but that we're all soon gone. And yet we have the potential, and we've seen humanity in the past 100 years, or even 50, give our own habitat, our own single planet, a fever, that has the potential, and everybody says it already is, a kind of runaway potential to dysregulate the homeostatic processes that have evolved at this particular distance from the sun on this planet over billions of years. And we are also capable of recognizing it. So this is where mindfulness comes in. It's not just mindfulness of the body or one's own thoughts or emotions or breath sensations, but we can be mindful of like that, you know, the photographic documentation of the state of the glaciers is kind of like on the way out, disappearing. The water supply, the drinking water supply for half the people on the planet, disappearing. The ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, disappearing. So this is a kind of real moment of waking up. And I feel like the mindfulness initiative in this particular document is really going to give policymakers and everybody else interfacing with this challenge in all the various ways that we need a whole diverse sort of group of people to interface with it, that it's really going to be a catalyst for the kind of wakefulness that's necessary to analyze, diagnose the disease that the planet is facing, and then developing a treatment plan that has the potential to restore some degree of balance, even in a very, very threatening moment, where if we don't make these changes soon, all of the prognostications are that it will be, in some sense, too late to have the planet for our grandchildren be even recognizable as what we've managed to live with up till now. So the stakes are unbelievably high. So I just want to offer the deepest of bows to everybody, but especially the three of you who have written this document and everybody who's collaborated in researching it and providing the material for both on the quote unquote outer side and quote unquote inner side, to actually amplify and catalyze the kind of wake-up call that's necessary at this particular moment on the planet, and then do not one thing about it, but do as many different collaborative, cooperative things about it as we can possibly do. And so that doing is very important, because it's very easy to think of mindfulness as kind of like, oh, I'm just being or blissing out or at one with the universe and, you know, all of that kind of stuff, none of which is exactly wrong, but it's very, very incomplete, because the profundity of our inner connection also means that we have a responsibility to attend to the nature of the threat that we're facing as a species. And that's not merely an intellectual abstraction, but that is very, very real. And so in a sense, we have a profound response-ability that we need to operationalize. And this document is going to be one very, very important catalyst for moving ahead at this particular moment in time. Let me just pause for a moment and in some sense remind us all that, as I said, this is a kind of all hands on deck moment. So everybody's putting their shoulder to the wheel is really important. And there's no one particular way to do it. We all have to find, in some sense, the way or the path that resonates with us. And so although there's a lot of talk about mindfulness in the sense that it really is, and I talk this way myself a lot, grounded in what we might call the domain of being. And we're so busy doing that we're like, you know, chickens with heads cut off, that we're running around busy doing without having any idea who's doing all this doing or why. But mindfulness is very important to point out is not passivity. Mindfulness is by no means a kind of vacuous spaciousness. It's very, very finely tuned. And so when our doing comes out of the domain of being, as opposed to out of mindless action, then it's an entirely different and highly, I would say, even in this time of COVID, infectious in the most positive of ways, meme for transmitting not merely alarm, but actually a sense of possibility and of the beauty associated with us seizing hold and recognizing what needs to be done, and then letting our actions and our doing come out of this heartful, deeply grounded domain of non-doing, of being. But that doesn't mean that we don't act when the time is right to act. And that's all part of the meditation practice. It's not like, oh, well, the silent part's the meditation, the action part's something else. No, we need as much mindfulness when we're interacting and acting in the world as we do when we're quietly sitting at home or lying in bed, feeling our breathing. So just the deepest of bows again to all of you for having, midwifed this document into the present moment. And I really want to just take a moment and let it register with me, because it was said, but I'm not sure how deeply it penetrated. If I heard you correctly, that the IPCC in its latest report is actually mentioned and documented with references mindfulness for the first time. And if that's true, that is a diagnostic of a certain kind of sea change that I think augurs well for this entire challenging moment that we're facing as a species. And I feel really gratified to have listened in on the kind of bringing of this report out into the world.
Thank you, Jon. That was wonderful. And in the spirit of wakefulness, which I think is exactly what we have been, there is a huge amount of wakefulness in our questions. And you're right in terms of intention. And we talked about this love affair and Jamie as well. And how do we have that beginner's mind and look at approaching in different ways, and that reconnection with nature? And from a WWF perspective, I cannot get over the statistic that since 1970, we've lost 68% of our species. I mean, I don't want to pick at anybody's age, but I'm sure there are some people who were born in 1970 on the call, and that's in their lifetime. We've destroyed nearly 3/4 of the planet's habitats and species. It's just mind-boggling. And how do we take that and actually put it into a wakefulness? So in terms of, we have a lot of questions. I'm going to go first of all, if it's okay, to Trish Bartley, who has got a question. Trish, are you all right to ask that? Or I know you were saying about me asking, but there was lots of messages. Can you come off mute and ask? And if
Yep, I can. Yeah, thank you, and thanks everybody. It's a really great event. This so important. So my question is really around climate apartheid. You know, this topic, this important topic of kind of, you know, those who are least privileged in the world actually being affected the most by the climate, and how can we manage this? Because how can we respond to our rather poor efforts currently to working with people of colour, including marginalised and discriminated communities? It somehow makes the already awful crisis even more huge and concerning.
Christine, are you okay to?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a very important point that you raised, so thanks for bringing it up. And it was also something we discussed quite a lot between us. I think also the last policy recommendation makes a link to that aspect as well. And I think just from a sustainability position also, we know that it's not enough anymore to talk about sustainable development. We have to talk about equitable, just and sustainable development as an explicit part of what we are doing and an explicit objective. And I think getting back to the report, I think there are many parts which directly speak to what you brought up. Many different parts. So one is obviously on the polarization, which is also directly linked to what you were saying. And perhaps just also to complement what Jamie presented. So if afterwards, for everybody, you go through the document, you will see that in a way, all the different aspects that we described, like, attention, receptivity, perspective taking, which is again, another important aspect in relation to what you just brought up, or turning towards the difficult, connect, holistic worldview, etc. In each of the sections, we first describe why we believe that that particular aspect is relevant and important for addressing the climate crisis in a sustainable and in a just way. Before we then turn to the importance of mindfulness and compassion and how we think then that relates to it. So just also as a reminder of how to read the document. So I think there are many different aspects in the document that relate to what you said. At the same time, I think you challenge us to make that even more prominent in the report. Just to give a context, the target group were mainly policymakers, more from a Western context. That's perhaps also important to highlight here, but it's what you're saying is absolutely crucial, and also to decolonize our knowledge in relation to the whole subject is absolutely crucial.
Thank you, Christine. I'm conscious we keep getting loads of questions. If it's okay to the authors, I'm going to move on to another question. Catherine.
This Catherine?
Catherine Weary, is that?
Okay. Yeah, okay, right. Quick question, Jamie. I'll try and make it quick. Is, as you know, I think we're all arguing that mindfulness is a foundational capacity. And there's two areas that I think I'd be interested to know how you're thinking about climate change with some of the other things that the Mindfulness Initiative and others are into. One is the role of education. I wondered if you'd like to say a little there about how mindfulness might link with efforts to educate young people about the climate crisis in all kinds of ways, and particularly this importance of developing inner capacities. Whether you've got any thoughts about that. I'll just stick to that question. I've got another one lurking, but I think that's just the only thing to ask you right now.
Thank you, Catherine. And we could have a 90-minute call about this. So I will focus my answer on the recommendation that we have. So one of the 7 recommendations is on education. And we say that sustainability education and also education about digital media and how to manage it should be a right of every pupil. But not just, we shouldn't just be learning about the crisis and the perils, but also equipping young people with the inner capacities to be able to cope with that information and to be able to respond appropriately. And so this is true across the life course, but particularly true for young people, because it seems the impact is disproportionate on them right now in terms of mental health concerns, but also because they're going to be living in the worst effects. And education more broadly needs a rebalancing, where it has traditionally focused on knowledge and in some cases skills, although often just knowledge, and knowledge that's going to become obsolete in 10, 20 years as the world keeps radically changing, and not really focusing on core foundational capacities of heart and mind, which are fundamental for everything we see, think, and do. So in general, yes, we need more capacity development in education, and particularly integrated with sustainability and sort of media and moral education. Absolutely.
Thanks, Jamie. If anybody else wants to come in, chip in, but I was just going to ask Mark Leonard if you were able to come in, because I thought you had a great question. Mark.
Hi, thanks, Katie, and thanks to everyone here today and looking at this subject. It's wonderful that this is coming into the whole area of discussion. So really my point is that, we can do very little as individuals, however evolved or informed our understanding might be, from a lifetime's work in working in sustainability, this is coming from. And so, so power to bring about change is a collective process. It's a social function. How can you translate, these personal, individual psychological capacities of, developing mindfulness and compassion? And how does that enable people to, how do you turn that into collective action? How do you enable people to act out of that? That's the question. It's more about a collective understanding of mind and what that is than an individual, in my view, that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, that goes deeply to the question of what is a human.
Yeah,
like we don't, and sociologists, I think, are fond of saying the primary unit of humanity is the group. Like we've never existed outside of it. And it's a very relative phenomenon that we decided that we are individuals in our little nuclear families and our little houses, and that's a lot of the kind of alienation and collapse in social trust and mental health problems that we're now seeing as a result of that problem in worldview, and that's something that we touch upon in this document. There's a problem in saying, however, that individuals can't do anything. Largely, I agree with you, Mark, and I'm going to come back round to saying why I do. but before we get there, I just want to say that not seeing our deep interconnectedness and seeing ourselves as individuals is disempowering, because it feels also big and massive and little of me, what can I do? And actually some of the writing in this area, particularly Joanna Macy's pioneering work, and it's, we probably shouldn't get to the end of this session without mentioning her name, because she spent decades basically advocating for exactly what we're writing about now. And also more recently, Karen O'Brien, who's a climate scientist who's written a book called You Matter More Than You Think about quantum social change. Both point towards an understanding of interconnectivity as helping us to feel our agency as individuals. So it's a both and. It's like we can't do it alone, but also as an individual we can do stuff. Everything we do matters. And we cannot predict the ripple effect in the same way that we could never predicted what Greta Thunberg's action sitting outside her school would have had as one of the most influential people of the last 10 years, globally. So yes, I agree, and we do need to feel empowered at an individual level as well as a group level, and not say, well, I haven't got a group and I haven't got any levers of power and I haven't, actually maybe everything you do matters. And also, yes, we must own it. The change will require us to think as groups, to act as groups, to have a self-concept in that way. Where I'm coming back around to, Mark, as I know, as a pioneer of social mindfulness yourself, our document mentions in this one, more than mentions, covers social mindfulness in at least 3 places, and mentions how this is an evolution in thinking about what we have on our hands here, coming as it did through originally pioneered by John, over 40 years ago, and many others through, had to come through a clinical prism, because that's where its roots were, and there have been countless innovators thinking about how this evolves now to have a colleague of mine is fond of saying, if mindfulness is the question, is the answer, what's the question? Question before was, how do we manage pain? I mean, it was once upon a time anyway, a long time ago. John's been doing much broader thinking and work since then. I don't want to reduce it to that. But this is the question now. How do we survive the 21st century.
Just to add, Jamie, to what you're saying, I think if we take it seriously that climate change and other types of sustainability challenges are a relationship crisis, if they are a crisis of disconnection, and we move towards a deep understanding of interconnection, then we can go beyond this separation of individual, cultural, and systems change, because they become one. I think in the words of John, I was saying that in a way, it's again wrong to separate between inner and outer change, because it is one thing. And I think if we take it seriously, if we deeply feel that connectedness, we can see how every single person is a change, an agent of change, and we can see the role everybody and the power everybody has to support change at collective and system level, and how it becomes one. There's one citation, I don't know if you have time that I can read it, because I found it so powerful with this interconnection. Katie, do you allow me to read something?
Of course.
Okay, it's a citation from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and I found that citation, it brings it so alive to what we're just discussing, and says, the true system, the real system, is our present construction of systematic thought itself, rationality itself. And if a factory is turned down, but the rationality which produced it is left standing, then that rationality will simply produce another factory. If a revolution destroys a systematic government, but the systematic patterns of thought that produced that government are left intact, then those patterns will repeat themselves in the succeeding government. There's so much talk about the system and so little understanding. And I think that is sort of expressing what we're just discussing together with Mark and Jamie and John and Rosie in the document.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you. I look forward to reading it.
Thank you, Christine. I apologise. We are completely overwhelmed with questions, and we only have 5 more minutes to go. Olivia's got a hand up, and Jürgen's messaging me directly along with others. Olivia, because you've raised your hand, go on. Why don't you do the last one? But can you make it really swift, because we've got to wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you. Then very briefly, just a thought listening to this wonderful conversation. I wonder whether linking mindfulness to pursuing change is in itself creating some sort of weight and demand that is not necessarily what is necessary, in the sense that it gives a goal and an activity and a pursuit, whilst perhaps it would be sufficient to just undo all those layers of obstacles that are the disconnections. And that in itself would perhaps deliver so much that we are looking for. Sorry, I don't know whether this makes sense. And it's not at all a critique, but I was listening to the questions and I hear the difficulties indeed of saying, can we scale this up? Can we? And all this belongs, I think, to somewhat a different language. But thank you so much for sharing all these wonderful thoughts, and thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. I think Jamie, you're on mute, but I'm going to hand over to Jamie and Christine for a final word. And please, I think Jamie and Christine, you've had access to the questions. There is a lot there. If you've seen any others that you wanted to pick up, and then Ruth is just going to do a minute on next steps. Sorry, Ruth, it's going to have to be really tight.
If we're doing a final closing word, then I'll hand over to Christine or Rosie first, if that's all right. And
I can perhaps just start with some words also in reaction to the last comment, and to put it perhaps a bit in the wider context of sustainability and linking sustainability work with this kind of inner work more broadly. And I think I'm very grateful for this last comment, because it gives me the chance and opportunity to say that really, if we talk about this kind of work, It's not about turning people into objects to be changed. That would definitely not be what we are talking about. So instead, what we want to talk about, or where we want to pay more attention to, is that it's about creating spaces and conditions that can nurture a culture of inner growth and mutual support and engagement from a place of shared universal values and connection. And that's why the whole report makes this point of reconnecting and getting to a place where we can come to this kind of reconnection. Yeah.
Rosie, do you want to?
Apologies, my connection froze me out for about the last 5 or 7 minutes, so I don't know where you are. So I'll just say thank you for now.
Okay.
Thank you, Rosie.
I wanted to sort of plug our previous work for those of you interested in the more sort of philosophical question of the paradox between being and doing. So I'm going to put a link in the chat here to our previous report 18 months ago, or rather it's a discussion paper called Mindfulness, Developing Agency in Urgent Times. So just acknowledging that tension between the qualities of, that were raised in that previous question I haven't got time to respond to. However, I do feel I think John wanted to say something, and he's sort of the master of sort of tackling this very paradox. So I wondered whether he had some final thoughts. I'm sorry, Katie, for hijacking it. We might have to go a minute over, but that would be really good if we could just hear a goodbye from him as well.
Well, I'm happy to say goodbye. I'm also happy to be silent because I'm just bathing in the resonances of what has been offered today, and of the 164 or so people who've been on this call, most of whom we have not seen. But there's a very real way in which I feel like we're feeling each other, just in the same way as we're feeling our way towards kind of into the next emergence of the possible. I'll just say that, there's an ancient Hindu and Buddhist image of Indra's net, which is a profound sort of model of interconnectedness, where the net is, sort of a vast net, like a fish net, but at every vertex, there's a diamond, a multifaceted diamond, and it's the property of Indra's net that every facet of every diamond reflects every other diamond in the net. And we could think of ourselves, humanity, in that way, or even all of reality in that way, that we, in Thich Nhat Hanh's language, we inter-are, we inter-be. That's our kind of default mode as a species, or as life itself on the planet. So if that's the actual true nature of our situation, then we really need to kind of perhaps recognize that true nature and then learn how to embody it and make maximal use of it. So the only other thing I'd say is kind of like an expression of gratitude to everybody who's been on this call. Is also a reminder that although we haven't had a period of formal meditation here because of the lack of time and so forth, that let's not forget that the real meditation practice is life itself. It's not sitting with your bum on a cushion on the floor or lying in bed in the corpse pose, although those are fabulous and very, very important. But the real meditation practice is how we live our lives moment by moment by moment, when we're quote unquote by ourselves and when we're with each other. And I feel like this has been in some sense a kind of deep bathing in that interconnectedness, and so is part of an ongoing meditative adventure and love affair that I hope it better be the received by the future in a way that it has to be in order for us to attain any kind of sense of dynamic balance or sustainability within the chaotic forces that work on the planet at the moment, in our own minds and in the world. So thank you, just enormous gratitude for you're inviting me to be a tiny part of this process.
I'll forgo my final comments, but yes, please sign up to our newsletter on our website if you'd like to be in touch about our future work. And yeah, we will have another. I think it might be good to have another follow-up event for questions if there's so much appetite.
I think to Jamie, and Ruth was just going to say, Ruth, what's the next steps in terms of the report? So if anybody wants to get involved. You're on mute, Ruth.
Sorry. So we'd basically love to hear from anybody who has any comments on it. As Jamie said, this is a consultation draft, so we're preparing the next version for tailored towards policymakers. So if you have any feedback, please email our info address, which we'll put in the chat. But we'll follow this up with email, so you have next steps as well. So just thank you from me as well.
Brilliant. And thank you so much for everybody for joining today. Thank you to an incredible amount of work that's gone in from the authors, you know, from Christine and Rosie and Jamie and John. Thank you for joining us, and for Ruth for keeping everything moving as well, for Pilar for answering all the questions and making sure. I'm sorry we didn't get back to all of them. We'll try and do a follow-up or directly if we can. Final thing, please continue your love affair with Mother Earth.